Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey. We're going to explore how ancient cultural practices of collective effort might just hold the key to solving some of our most pressing modern systemic crises. We'll be looking at a brilliant compilation of research from an exhibition titled Structures of Mutual Support. So if you've ever wondered how communities manage to survive when formal institutions fail, well, you are in exactly the right place. Okay. Let's dive into this. We're going to cover 5 key areas today. First, the crisis of development. Second, what is mutual support? Third, Bayanihan and survival. Fourth, Norway's Dugnad. And finally, reimagining our future. I promise you, the heavy economic theory up front is going to lead directly to some incredibly tangible cultural stories. Everything we're covering today really revolves around this single, ancient, yet incredibly urgent question. How will we live together? The source text points out that the urgency here rises from a number of unfolding global crises that are happening at totally unprecedented scales and speeds. Our current ways of living together are, quite frankly, proving unsustainable, both socially and environmentally. And the massive scale of these modern issues, it requires completely new ways of finding, negotiating, and acting upon solutions. To understand why we need these new solutions, let's first look at Section 1, the crisis of development, to really set the global context and understand the problem we're currently facing. So following the Second World War, the world largely embraced what we call mainstream development. This was heavily focused on economic growth, top-down market efficiency, universalizing a single market culture, and mostly measuring success through GDP. The basic assumption was that economic gains at the top would simply trickle down to everyone else. But in reaction to this highly homogenizing approach, the alternative development movement emerged. This framework emphasizes bottom-up participatory approaches. It argues that culturally and geographically situated knowledge, the actual lived experiences of local people, absolutely must be the foundation of development to create self-organized, democratic spaces. The source text outlined several critiques of neoliberal globalization to show exactly why this alternative perspective is gaining so much traction. It notes that deregulation and international economic integration have basically created a system that largely prioritizes shareholders over local stakeholders. The outcomes reported here include an increasingly uneven and divisive world. We're seeing widening social inequalities. To put that into perspective, over 70% of the global population is currently living in countries where income inequality has worsened since 1990. Concurrently, top income tax rates have declined, and the looming climate crisis threatens to exacerbate these inequalities even further. The text argues that this market-driven globalization has essentially relocated decision-making power far away from local democracies. So, if top-down, market-driven development is struggling to address these systemic issues, what on earth is the alternative? Let's move to Section 2. What is mutual support? To really grasp this, we have to look at the concept of mutual aid. This is a term posited by activist and philosopher Peter Kropotkin way back in 1901. Kropotkin studied the animal world and realized something profound. The propagation of a species isn't just conditioned by the survival of the fittest or individual competition. Actually, it's often defined by the ability to come together in the face of adversity. This theoretical bedrock shows us that throughout history, human survival has relied heavily on non-hierarchical relationships where people invest their time rather than their money to ensure collective survival. Let's move from theory to practice. In Section 3, we're transitioning geographically to look at Bayanihan and survival, reciprocity in the Philippines. Just look at the visual details in this magnificent 1962 watercolor by Carlos Batang Francisco. This image perfectly captures the highly romanticized, completely selfless vision of Bayanihan. You see a group of men collectively carrying a traditional bamboo and thatch house on poles, helping a neighbor relocate. The term itself is often said to derive from bayani, meaning hero, someone who serves the community without asking for anything in return. It's an idealized representation of an innate national spirit of absolute generosity and group work. However, the researchers point out that this romantic view has sometimes been state-sponsored and utilized for very specific agendas. For example, during the 1970s, Ferdinand Marcos heavily pushed this ideology of the idealized rural community as part of his corporatist vision for a new society. The image of the men carrying the house was placed on pamphlets and school textbooks to epitomize a unified national spirit. It's a really fascinating example of how political figures historically reinvented and utilized indigenous traditions to support their own governance structures. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is peeling back that romantic myth of pure, selfless heroism to reveal a much older, gritty, and highly transactional reality. In rural communities, mutual support actually operated under concepts like gantihan, where the root word means to reciprocate, and turnuhan, which means taking one's turn. This was a tit-for-tat system, and it wasn't just vague goodwill, right? It was governed by strict ledgers. For example, at a funeral wake, a family member might sit there with an exercise book, meticulously listing the names and amounts donated by neighbors just to ensure the family repays that exact debt on a future occasion. If a farmer owed labor and couldn't attend a workday, they literally had to hire a replacement to maintain their social standing. So why was this strict accounting so incredibly necessary? The source text makes it clear. There is a real need to believe in something like Bayanihan in an archipelago as geographically dangerous as the Philippines. This cooperation wasn't just a cultural nicety, it was a hardcore survival mechanism. In an environment frequently devastated by typhoons, floods, and fires, and where the state couldn't always guarantee security, trust absolutely had to be reposed in the extended community. Helping your neighbor wasn't just altruism, it was the ultimate insurance policy that they would help you when disaster inevitably struck your own home. All right, let's shift continents entirely. In Section 4, Dugnad, Norway's collective effort, we'll see how this exact concept adapts across totally different geographies and climates. I want you to let this number sink in for a second. 142,000. In the year 2017 alone, the aggregated voluntary efforts generated by Dugnad in Norway amounted to 142,000 full-time equivalents. That is a massive, frankly shocking amount of unpaid civic labor being injected directly into the society. It covers everything from housing and sports to childcare and leisure activities. These historical photos show early Dugnads in action, things like cooperative building and roof tiling. Much like the Philippines, Norwegian farms in scattered settlements sometimes needed way more labor than a single family could provide, so they called on their neighbors. What makes Dugnad unique, particularly in the European context, is the historical absence of nobility or powerful landlords dictating the work. It is fundamentally egalitarian. No one stands above the others. Influence is entirely proportional to the sweat equity you put in. You're trading time, not money. The etymology here is just beautiful. The word dognad stems from Old Norse duge, meaning work or to master something, combined with did, meaning virtue or deed. It shows that practical work and moral norms are inextricably linked. The virtue becomes visible through the practice. And crucially, a dognad is almost always followed by a gildi, a shared meal or non-economic payment. Even today, if young Norwegians organize a dognad to help a friend move apartments, it always ends with pizza and beer. This post-work gildi is absolutely essential because it actively strengthens the social coherence and moral obligations within the community. So the crucial point is that whether we are looking at a tropical archipelago or a Nordic landscape, these systems exist. Let's move to our final section, reimagining our global future. Mutual support is absolutely not an isolated phenomenon. It is a universal human strategy. Look at these global variations: takut in Finland, barn raising in the United States, motiro mithal tikyo. Across entirely different cultures all over the world, we see the exact same foundational concept. They are platforms for people to act on their own situations, using their own local knowledge, skills, and experience. They rely on each other rather than waiting around for a top-down solution. Which brings us to this incredibly powerful quote from the text. Traditions of mutual support could potentially be a platform for people to take action outside the institutions and value systems that gave shape to the situation that we find ourselves in today. This connects all the way back to the modern crises we mentioned at the start. If mainstream, market-driven development has created systemic inequalities and environmental crises, then relying on those same institutions to fix the problems might just be a dead end. Instead, these historical practices of self-organized democratic participation show us exactly how we can bypass failing institutional structures entirely. The challenge of our time is to renew the rules under which our society operates. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. How can you apply the principles of mutual support, whether it's the strict reciprocity of Bayanihan or the egalitarian spirit of Dugnad, to bypass failing structures in your own community? We don't have to wait for the top-down fix, you know? The blueprint for living together is already written in our history. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring these incredible cultural strategies.